In a packed House of Commons, the Prime Minister delivered a line that sent a shockwave through Ottawa. The days, he said, of our military sending 70 cents of every dollar to the United States are over. The chamber erupted in a standing ovation. But that viral moment wasn't the first move in this game. It was the public announcement of a much quieter, far more significant decision made thousands of miles away. The noise was in Ottawa. The real story began in Tokyo, and it forces us to ask a fundamental question. What happens when one of America's closest allies quietly starts planning for a future where Washington is no longer the center of its defense world? That question hangs in the air because the answer began to form on March 6, 2026, not in a crowded parliament, but in a quiet formal room in Tokyo. On one side of a polished table sits Canada's Defense Minister, David McGuinty. Across from him, his Japanese counterpart, Shinjiro Kisumi. There are no cameras here, no grand announcements. The only sound is the low hum of the building's climate control. The atmosphere is one of immense, deliberate weight, where every word is a carefully placed piece on a global chessboard. And then the move is made. Minister Kisumi, with the precise language of high-stakes diplomacy, formally invites Canada to join the Global Combat Air Program, the advanced fighter jet project between Japan, the UK, and Italy, with observer status. Now, that term, observer status, sounds intentionally mild. It sounds passive, like you've been given a seat in the gallery, far from the action, but you have to understand the language of statecraft. This wasn't an invitation to the cheap seats. This was the key to a classified reading room, a launch pad for long-term participation, as the internal documents would later call it. What it really meant was that Canada, without the massive financial commitment of a full partner, was being granted structured access to confidential project data, to engineering timelines, to the industrial pathways that would define the next 50 years of military aviation. It was an opportunity to see the blueprints, to understand the supply chains, and to map out exactly where Canadian industry could fit in, all before buying a single share in the company. It was a brilliant, low-risk, high-insight gambit. And more than that, it was a signal. By stepping inside this trilateral pact, Canada was quietly building its first major pillar in a defense architecture that wasn't centered on Washington. The move in that Tokyo room was the first concrete action, the first physical piece of a strategy to ensure Canada's sovereign choices are never again dependent on a single partner. But a move like this, an offer of this magnitude between allies, it doesn't just materialize out of thin air. That level of trust has to be earned. The offer made by Minister Kisumi was only possible because of years of hidden groundwork, the quiet laying of diplomatic and industrial infrastructure far from the public eye. Before Canada could be invited into that room in Tokyo, it first had to build the door. And how that door was built, that's where the real strategy begins. So, how was that door to the Tokyo meeting built? Well, a deal this significant doesn't happen overnight. To understand how Canada secured that seat at the table, we need to rewind the clock just a few weeks to a headline in late January 2016 that almost everyone missed. While the political world was focused on other things, a quiet, profoundly important event took place in Ottawa. On January 27th, Canada's Defense Minister, David McGuinty, and the Japanese Ambassador, Kanji Yamanouchi, signed a document. It was called the Equipment and Technology Transfer Agreement. Now, I know that sounds incredibly dry. It sounds like the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that puts you to sleep. But this was the entire game. Think of it this way. You can't run a continent-spanning high-speed rail line just by buying a train. You first have to lay down the thousands of kilometers of steel track. You have to build the switching systems, the legal rights of way, the entire electrical grid. You have to build the infrastructure. That's exactly what this agreement was. It created the legal and industrial railway for everything that would come next. It answered all the hard, boring questions in advance. If we build something together, who owns the intellectual property? How do we securely transfer sensitive technology between our defense industries? How do our companies actually work together without drowning in red tape? This wasn't a ceremonial handshake. It was the deliberate, methodical construction of a strategic highway between Ottawa and Tokyo, making a project as complex as GCAP even possible to discuss. It was proof that Canada wasn't just showing up to a meeting, it was showing up prepared. The secret meeting in Tokyo, the observer status, the groundwork in Ottawa, the pieces are all on the board. You can see the sheer intentionality of the strategy. A quiet, systematic pivot, but that raises the one single question that truly matters. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Why orchestrate this complex multi-year shift away from the United States, our oldest and most powerful ally? The answer isn't about rejecting a friendship. It's about recognizing a fundamental change in the world itself. And that recognition, well, that's what we need to talk about next. Isn't happening in Beijing or Moscow. The fundamental change driving this entire strategy is happening in Washington, D.C. For decades, the Canada-US relationship has been the fixed point in our universe, the world's longest undefended border, our largest trading partner, our closest military ally. It's a story we tell ourselves, and for the most part, it's been true. But behind the curtain of diplomatic handshakes, a different conversation has begun. A conversation of pressure. Quietly at first, then becoming louder, the central revelation, the real why behind the pivot to GCAP is this. It is not primarily an opportunity. It is a necessary response to a growing existential crisis in our relationship with the United States. This isn't speculation. The evidence is clear and documented. A March 2026 analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies lays out the escalating economic frictions. Official statements from the U.S. Trade Representative identify long-standing Canadian policies as a sore point. The language is no longer friendly. So let's pause here for a moment, because it's easy to hear economic pressure and dismiss it as technical noise. But what we're talking about next isn't just about tariffs. This is the tectonic plate shifting beneath 80 years of Canadian foreign policy. And understanding this single shift is the key that unlocks the entire playbook. This is the moment Canada stops treating its relationship with the United States as a constant in the equation and starts treating it as a variable. The flashpoint is the upcoming high-stakes renegotiation of the CUSMA trade agreement. On the table are direct U.S. demands to dismantle Canada's supply management system for dairy, poultry, and eggs. For Washington, it's a core irritant to be removed. For Ottawa, it's a sovereign domestic policy. And right there, the conflict is laid bare. This isn't just about milk prices. This is about whether Canada can write its own laws without asking for permission from Washington. Suddenly, the move towards GCAP, that secret meeting in Tokyo, the infrastructure agreement, it wasn't just about buying a new fighter jet. It was about buying back a piece of our own sovereignty for the next 50 years. This is the delicate tightrope Canada is walking, maintaining its most critical alliance while simultaneously building an escape hatch. In your view, is this a brilliant strategic necessities or a risky gamble? Share your thoughts in the comments. This entire recalibration is a direct reaction to the risks posed by an increasingly unpredictable Washington. It forced Canada to hedge its bets, to build what you could call a second safety net for its national sovereignty. The logic becomes unavoidable. If your primary safety net is showing signs of fraying, you don't just patch it. You start building another one. And that raises the next critical question. If the pressure was on and a new strategy was needed, why GCAP specifically? Why this program with these partners? The answer lies not in the door that was opened, but in the two doors that were slammed shut. So, what were those two doors that slammed shut? The first was in Europe. On paper, the option looked promising. the Future Combat Air System, or FCAS, led by France, Germany, and Spain, a powerful pan-European alliance. But when Ottawa looked closer, the project was frozen in place. The core partners, Airbus and Dassault, were locked in a bitter fight over leadership and how to divide the work. The entire project stalled. The original target to have a plane in the air by 2040 slipped to 2045, then possibly beyond. For Canada needing a stable platform for the future, this was a non-starter. So if the European option was the porridge that was too cold, the next logical door to knock on was right next door in Washington. The American program, the Next Generation Air Dominance, or NGN, is the most advanced on the planet. But when Canada approached, the door didn't just stay closed, it was bolted from the inside. The NGAD is a strictly US-only development. There is no established path for allied co-development, no observer seat, no in. This wasn't a slight, it was a statement of strategic reality. The United States is building its next generation system for itself. For Canada, trying to build a second safety net, hitching its wagon to a program that offered zero access and zero industrial partnership was simply not an option. That porridge was far too hot, completely inaccessible. And this is where the cool-headed strategic thinking becomes so clear. This wasn't a desperate leap, it was a process of elimination on a global chessboard. The European door was closed by delay. The American door was closed by design. And that left one viable path forward, the Global Combat Air Program. It was structured, it was multinational, and most importantly, it was welcoming. It offered Canada the exact launch pad it was looking for, the porridge that was just right. But to truly understand the sheer audacity of this pivot, looking at the technology isn't enough. You have to understand the historical precedent. You have to look to France. And you have to look to a single man who, in 1966, faced a near-identical crisis of sovereignty and dependency. His name was Charles de Gaulle. The dramatic choice he made, the crisis he was willing to provoke to restore his nation's autonomy, that is the precise playbook being studied in Ottawa today. And that story is where this gets truly interesting. So what was this playbook? What was the move so dramatic, so decisive, that it's being studied in Ottawa almost 60 years later? To see it, we have to go back to the 1960s. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, found itself in a paradox. It was a victor of World War II, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power. But inside the architecture of NATO, it was a junior partner. The real command structure, the ultimate decisions on war and peace, didn't run through Paris. They ran through Washington. For de Gaulle, this was an unacceptable erosion of sovereignty. He saw a future where France could be dragged into an American-led conflict it did not choose. So he proposed a solution. An equal, three-way leadership directorate for NATO. France, the United States, and the United Kingdom would run the alliance as true peers. The proposal was flatly rejected. And in that rejection, the crisis became crystal clear. Partnership without equality was just a polite word for subordination. The board was set. The pieces were in place. And de Gaulle made his move. Imagine the scene. It's March 7th, 1966. A formal letter from the Élysée Palace arrives at the White House for President Lyndon B. Johnson. There are no diplomatic niceties, no room for interpretation. It is a declaration of structural independence. In it, de Gaulle announces France's determination to regain on her whole territory the full exercise of her sovereignty. It states that France would cease participation in NATO's integrated commands and would no longer place its forces at NATO's disposal. And then the hammer blow. All foreign NATO forces and their bases had 1 year to leave French soil. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The shock among the Allies was seismic, but de Gaulle was immovable. And so the concrete result of sovereignty began to unfold. NATO headquarters were packed up and moved from Paris to Brussels. American bases that had been on French soil since the end of the war dismantled their operations and left. NATO flags were lowered in Paris for the last time. Sovereignty was no longer an idea discussed in a treaty. It was a physical fact on the ground. Crucially, France never left the political alliance. It simply withdrew from the integrated military command that it felt threatened its autonomy. This was the masterstroke. It reset the terms of engagement. For the next 4 decades, France charted its own course, built its own independent nuclear deterrent, the force de frappe, and acted as a truly sovereign middle power, all while remaining a core Western ally. It was a playbook for having your cake and eating it too. So you see, Canada's move towards GCAP isn't an impulsive emotional reaction. It is the execution of a classic, time-tested strategy. But what's truly fascinating, and where this story takes another turn, is that the best language to describe this strategy today doesn't come from a geopolitical textbook. It comes from Wall Street. At its core, Canada's strategy can be understood through a powerful idea from a completely different field. The principle of portfolio risk management. The logic is as elegant as it is ruthless. Just as a smart investor doesn't put all their money into one stock, no matter how reliable it has seemed, a smart nation cannot stake its entire security on a single partner, no matter how historic the alliance. The partnership with the United States was the original blue chip stock. For generations, it was the foundation of Canada's geopolitical portfolio, stable, predictable, and delivering consistent returns. But today, that stock is showing volatility. The market itself is changing. So prudent managers must adapt. This is not a panic sell. It is a strategic rebalancing. Enter GCAP. In this financial analogy, the Global Combat Air Program represents the new high-growth international tech stock. It's an asset class from a different geography, Asia and Europe, with a different risk profile and a different growth trajectory. It is the calculated hedge meticulously chosen to ensure that the entire portfolio can survive and even thrive through the next market shock. And this is where the term observer status becomes so critical. In financial terms, observer status is a low-cost, real option. Think of it as paying a small premium to acquire the right, but not the obligation to invest more heavily later. It gives Canada a seat at the table, access to critical information, and a view into the technology's development, all without committing billions in sunk costs. It grants maximum flexibility for minimal upfront risk. This is the second safety net being woven in real time. But to see this purely as a defensive hedge, as just a financial instrument to mitigate downside risk, is to see only half the picture. That's the story of preventing a fall. The more profound story is about building a platform from which to climb. Because this strategy isn't just about diversifying suppliers. It's about earning a place as a partner in the supply chain itself. And that pivot from a simple consumer to a valued creator is where the next chapter of Canada's sovereignty truly begins. And this transformation from a simple consumer to a valued creator isn't some vague aspiration. It's a concrete 50-year playbook. The first chapter is already being written. For decades, our strategic thinking has been fundamentally reactive, plugging holes, managing dependencies. We looked at the world and asked, how do we mitigate risk? But the decision to engage with GCAP isn't about patching the old ship. It's about laying the keel for a new one. That observer status, which sounds so passive, is the most proactive step we've taken in a generation. It's the low-risk entry point, the ticket to a room where the next generation of global technology is being designed. Think about what this changes. For years, we've accepted a reality where for every dollar we spend on major defense procurement, up to 70 cents can flow directly to foreign, primarily American contractors. We were exporting our capital to build someone else's industrial base. That's the price of being just a customer. this playbook flips that script. It begins a long-term compounding process. As a senior Canadian official confirmed, this move is designed to offer Canadian defense contractors an opportunity to supply parts or services. The policy itself explicitly leaves the door open for future manufacturing, procurement, or even joining the development phase. This is about more than jobs, though it will create them. This is about knowledge transfer. It's about our engineers working on 6th generation technology. It's about our companies becoming integral parts of a secure, allied supply chain. Over a decade, that builds expertise. Over 2 decades, it builds industries. Over 50 years, it builds sovereignty. And that is the end game of this strategic chess match. It's not just about surviving the current game, it's about changing Canada's position on the board for all future games. The goal is that in 50 years, when a critical technology is needed, Canada isn't just a consumer waiting in line with a checkbook. We are a creator, we are a partner, we are at the table where the decisions are made because we helped build the table. We've looked at the history, the economics, and the 50-year industrial strategy. Now it's time to put all the pieces on the board and look at the finished picture. So the pieces are now on the board. The picture is complete. What began as a viral soundbite in Parliament, a confession that felt like an admission of dependency, and what followed with a quiet, unpublicized meeting in Tokyo, all of it now reveals itself for what it truly is. A masterclass in modern statecraft. Think about where we started this journey. We started with a Canada sending 70 cents of every defense dollar south of the border. We end with a Canada holding a seat at the table with the rising and established powers of Europe and Asia. This isn't just about changing spending habits. This is about changing our nation's place in the world. The character arc is undeniable. Canada has transformed from a seemingly passive, dependent ally into a proactive, strategic actor, quietly building a diversified network to secure its own future in a world that is no longer dominated by a single power. And let's be absolutely clear, this isn't a story about anti-Americanism. It's a story of pro-Canadian realism. It is the sober recognition that the old order is fading and that in an uncertain world, the greatest risk is to have only one option. This is about building a second safety net, not cutting the first one. Which brings us to the final and most profound question that this entire strategy puts before us. Is this move simply one country's policy choice, or is it a sign of the inevitable evolution of alliances, a signal that middle powers are no longer waiting for an invitation, but are now actively shaping a new global order themselves? This is the new chessboard. If you want to understand the next move before it becomes a headline, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications.